we're pleased to have Robert with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing his talk on dubious gastronomy, the cultural politics of eating Asian in the USA, especially about Spam. I know as a child of the 50s and 60s, I ate a lot of Spam sandwiches. My mother didn't do much more with it other than cut it up and put it in a sandwich, but I'm interested to hear more about Spam. And so thank you for being here. As always, if you've brought a what's it, hold it for the end of the meeting. And Robert, if you want to stick around and join us, a what's it is something that the person who has it knows about it, but those of us who are watching may not. So we try to figure out what it is. And Cece, thank you for volunteering to give Robert a more thorough introduction.
Yes, oops, I have to unmute, sorry. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Okay, well, we've been looking forward to hearing Robert's talk. He is an associate professor of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University of the State University of New York. And before that, he taught at Caltech in San Luis Obispo and Hunter College and the City University of New York. His research interests include Asian American studies, food studies, and studies of the transnational Korean popular culture. He is the author of Dubious Gastronomy, the Cultural Politics of Eating Asian in the United States, and co-author of 3 anthologies. So I know you're all interested to hear about Robert, and Audrey Hong is summarizing his talk for our March Chow line.
And I'm recording the whole presentation, so you all will get a link later in the week.
And if we should, Robert, how would you like questions to be directed to you? We tend to put them in the chat file, and then Pat relays them, or we have had a presenter who would just prefer to have people ask them to you as the presentation goes forward. What works best for you?
Yeah, one might be the best is after I finish my prepared talk, which should be about 40 minutes, to open it up. And if people want to ask questions directly, I prefer that as opposed to the chat. It would be much, I think, interpersonal.
All right,
Okay.
Thank you. We'll do it that way.
Do you want to mute everybody?
Yeah, I'm gonna mute all, and then Robert, you can share your screen and unmute yourself, and I think we're ready to go. So here we go. Muting now.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted right now, and I will share my screen. So at any point, if there's a problem, please let me know. So can everyone see the screen? Can everyone hear me?
I can.
Great, thank you.
See and hear.
Okay, so I would like to first begin with a word of thanks to Cece, Pam, Judy, Patrick, and all other members of the Culinary Historians of Washington, D.C. for your kind invitation. It's truly an honor to share my work with you. And happy Valentine's Day, everyone. In Dubious Gastronomy, my book published in 2014, I explored 6 foods that share 2 things in common. First, each is strongly associated with Asians and Asian Americans. And second, each is considered dubious in some way. By dubious, I mean inauthentic, disreputable, or artificial. These foods are, namely, the California roll, Chinese takeout, kimchi, dog meat, monosodium glutamate, and the canned meat product Spam. I focus on these 6 foods because I believe each share a spiritual fellowship with Asians in the United States, in that the Asian presence in the US is also considered to be watered down, counterfeit, or debased manifestation of a so-called real thing. Like these foods, Asian Americans have been seen as dubious. That is to say, as bad, subpar, imitative, or corrupt. In fact, for the past century and a half, Asian Americans have been regarded as doubly dubious, as insufficiently Asian and unreliably American. So you might expect that I wrote this book in order to defend Asian Americans against the charges that they are inauthentic, both as Asians and as Americans. But no, that was not my intention. Instead of setting out to prove that Asian Americans are in fact authentic, I argue that the very notion of authenticity is troubling, and troublesome. In a nutshell, authenticity is a mirage. To seek it is to search for something that only exists as an idea, like Bigfoot. Just as it would be silly for any of us to go out hunting for Bigfoot, it is foolhardy, I believe, to believe that the authentic culture is out there somewhere waiting to be discovered. But there's another reason I wrote this book. I wrote it just in case I was wrong. What if authenticity is real? What if someone actually captures Bigfoot? That would be pretty embarrassing for me. So the other reason I wrote this book is to argue that even if authenticity is something real, and it exists, and even if Asian Americans are doubly dubious, well, that's okay. You see, there is something wonderful about being dubious, about being non-standard, impure, and profane. Yes, sometimes it is good to be bad. So what if Asian Americans don't measure up to the mythical standards of Asia or the arbitrary standards of America? Being Asian American is its own thing, and it is for the most part a beautiful thing. And just like the dubious foods I write about in the book, the dubious is often quite delicious. Although it's hard for me to believe, it's now been over a decade since I first began exploring the ideas that would become dubious gastronomy. So the question I have for myself now is whether the book has aged well, like, say, fine wine, or has become stale, like, say, moldy bread. I'm guessing the answer lies somewhere in between. So today, I'd like to share with you something fresher and more closely connected to my current book project, tentatively titled Hot, 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 Korean Food in the Age of K-Pop. So my apologies to Anne because I won't be talking about spam unless during Q&A, I can certainly talk about it then. So this new project is in many ways a sequel to dubious gastronomy. This new work brings together the three areas of research that I've been most deeply involved with during the past 5 years or so, namely food studies, popular culture studies, and transnational and diasporic Korean studies. The three hots of the title refer to the three principal characteristics that I believe perfectly embodies Korean food today from a transnational and diasporic perspective. Hot meaning spicy, tangy, piquant. Hot meaning sizzling, boiling, scalding. And hot meaning popular, trendy, and cool. I know of no other national or ethnic cuisine that simultaneously embodies at its core all three of these meanings of hot. But if I were to be completely honest with you, the true reason for wanting to present this newer work, and I actually changed my mind like yesterday actually, so I redid my presentation, is because of what happened yesterday in the Senate. Although I fully expected the outcome of yesterday's impeachment trial, I'm still feeling quite numb and dumbfounded. So please indulge and humor me as I try to figure out the limits and possibilities of this country's social, cultural, and political potential by entertaining this question: is that kimchi in my taco? Or how Korean food conquered America? So this will be my topic for today. About 4 years ago, well, 4 years and 3 months ago or so, I was a nervous wreck. I was a nervous wreck because even though I was near certain that Hillary had it in the bag, I knew she could still blow it. Well, in the off chance that any of you haven't heard the news, this guy won. I think the journalist Katie Tur summed it up best when she declared, "Unbelievable." Meanwhile, Hillary, shell-shocked and clueless, unfortunately, is still wondering what happened. If any of you care to recall, it was an ugly contest, even as even the most neutral of observers denounced the various positions held by Donald Trump as sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and racist, and with good reasons. At the center of his message was the Great Wall, not the one in China, but the yet to be built wall with Mexico. In a speech he gave to a large crowd in Phoenix in August 2016, Trump repeated what had become his signature slogan: "We will build the Great Wall along the southern border, and Mexico will pay for the wall." As the crowd chanted back, "Build the wall, build the wall," Trump made a promise. On day one, we will begin working on an impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern wall, he said. I guess we're still waiting for the wall to be built. A day after the speech, a Trump surrogate named Marco Gutierrez, a Mexican-born founder of a group called Latinos for Trump, appeared on a cable news program to explain why the wall was needed. My culture, Mexican culture, is a very dominant culture. It is imposing and it's causing problems. If you don't do anything about it, you're going to have taco trucks on every corner. Now, reactions to this statement were swift. While most were some variations of the observation that racist ideas do not become less racist because it comes from the mouth of a non-white person, another sentiment began to dominate the political blogs and social media. Yes, how amazing it would be to have a taco truck in every corner. That would indeed make America great again. To the countless numbers of Americans who are partial to tacos, a taco truck parked a corner from their home or work would indeed be a gastronomic godsend. And as a lover of tacos who just happens to be Korean American, I find this idea especially appealing due to a particular culinary trend that has been on the rise in the United States in the past decade. If there is to be a taco truck in every corner, it is not inconceivable that the purveyor would be a Korean American, and the tacos will be filled with kimchi and other ingredients that are common to Korean cookery, such as bulgogi, galbi, gochugaru, and gochujang. And here are some examples of Korean tacos. For all intent and purposes, the Korean taco truck phenomena can be said to have originated in Los Angeles with the 2008 inauguration of Roy Choi's Kogi barbecue truck. Born in Korea in 1970, Choi moved with his family to the United States at the age of 2 and grew up in Southern California among not only Koreans, but also African Americans, whites, Mexicans, and other Latinos. The Kogi barbecue menu, tacos, burritos, quesadillas, hot dogs, and burgers loaded with a combination of Korean and Mexican and American ingredients and flavors, is essentially a story of this Korean, Mexican, American congruence. Choi has called it Los Angeles on a plate, and his vision of LA in one bite. True to the notion that imitation is the greatest form of flattery, copycat food trucks operated by both Koreans and non-Koreans soon sprung up across the country. Gorilla Barbecue and Kimchi Taco in New York City, Cilantro Barbecue in Austin, Texas, Korean Barbecue Taco Box in Orlando, Florida, Koreanos in Houston, Mogul Barbecue in the Bay Area, and close to most of you, I guess, where you live, Tak Korean in Washington, D.C., to merely scratch the surface. The trend became so widespread that as early as 2010, counterfeiting and intellectual property experts wondered in Freakonomics, who owns the Korean taco? The answer basically was no one. Korean tacos are not just sold in trucks, of course. Number of brick and mortar establishments that have the item on the menu is not only considerable, but constitutes a nationwide phenomenon. Whether or not Trump builds the wall in the future, he has, it appears that Korean tacos are here to stay. And this is strongly suggested by the fact that as early as 2012, the popular restaurant chain TGI Fridays rolled out what it called Korean steak tacos. Composed of 3 corn tortillas filled with strips of marinated black Angus flat iron steak, topped with ginger lime slaw, cucumbers, fresh cilantro, basil, and sriracha sauce, the tacos were served alongside jasmine rice pilaf. The reviews that followed were not kind, as one person described it as not a nice meal. So this is the actual picture someone took at the restaurant, and this is the ad for the product. What makes this noteworthy for me is not the question of how it tastes, but why the corporate bigwigs of TGI Fridays decided to call it Korean steak tacos when there's nothing specifically Korean about it. Granted, the dish makes no claim of being traditional Korean food. They are tacos after all, not say 된장찌개, samgyetang, or bibimbap. Even so, why label it Korean when virtually nothing about it suggests anything recognizably Korean or Mexican for that matter, except perhaps for the tortilla, I suppose. If anything, it seems very Southeast Asian. Until just recently, Korean food was but a minor blip on the radar of American food. On the rare occasion when Korean food made the news, it was often negative, as the food under the media spotlight was usually one of 2 things: kimchi and its malodor, or dog meat and its inhumaneness. To many Korean Americans who came of age before this past decade, Korean food was a source of deep ambivalence. On the one hand, it was our food, an essential marker of our Koreanness. On the other hand, it was not the sort of food that you wanted to share with non-Korean due to fear of rejection and ridicule. To go further, Korean food was for many Korean Americans like myself a source of shame. Yes, it could be delicious, and you could not live without it for any stretch of time, but it was so different. It was not like any other so-called ethnic cuisine. Even when compared to Chinese or Japanese food, neither of which is without its own vexed history in the US, Korean food somehow seemed more alien. Sure, Chinese food had the relatively quotidian wonton soup, and Chinese had miso soup, but Koreans had the feverishly crimson yukgaejang. And while Chinese had the relatively benign lo mein, and Japanese had ramen, Koreans had the impossibly inky jjajangmyeon. Comparably speaking, Korean food was fiercer and more audacious. But above all, Korean food was miasmic, odoriferous. Simply put, Korean food stank. To varying degrees, most children of immigrants at some point in their lives experience a love-hate relationship with the food of their national origin. In the previous century, generations of Italian immigrants endured being called garlic eaters, and Germans suffered the indignity of being called krauts. Mexican Americans still have to put up with the beaner epithet. One way people of a society attempt to separate the so-called in-group from the out-group is by building a conceptual wall between what they interpret as our and their cultures. In this picture, ABC is short for American-born Chinese. FOB stands for fresh off the boat. This has certainly been the case in the United States, vis-a-vis the experience of countless different immigrant groups that make up the country's populace. A shared American ritual among young immigrants has been and continues to be the public rejection of past identities, language, religion, food, and other cultural expressions and markers, which are seen as un-American. As a prerequisite of joining the new world, the new arrivals are pressured to shed the odor of the old world. And what single cultural element embodies odoriferousness more so than food? This is more easily said than done, of course, as the smells of previous lives tend to resist even the most desperate scrubbing. For Korean Americans, the stink of Korean food seemed impossible to conceal or jettison. comprised significantly of fermented products, Korean food was simply too overwhelming. This applies not only to the many different types of kimchi, but nearly everything else of culinary consequence in Korean cooking, such as gochujang, doenjang, samjang, ganjang, and so forth. So what you have is going from 9 o'clock clockwise is gochujang, which is a fermented. I'm sorry, that is probably samjang, which is a mixture of what comes next at 12 o'clock, which is doenjang, which is Korean miso, basically. And then gochujang, which is 3 o'clock, which is chili paste. And then at 6 o'clock, that would be Korean soy sauce, all fermented products. In other words, anything that makes Korean food Korean carries the potential of miasma. As food science has shown, the natural outcome of the process of lactic acid fermentation is tanginess of flavor and smell. To say that Korean food tastes and smells tangy would be the gastronomic understatement of the century. When my family first came to the United States in the early 1970s, the only way for us to eat kimchi was at home was for my mother to make it by hand. Well, that's not my mom. That's a picture that I found on the internet. In those early days, it was often difficult to procure many of the ingredients to make even the most basic types of kimchi, such as what they call pechu kimchi. Mainstream markets did not sell Napa cabbage, which is what this is made of. So my mother improvised by using the widely available green cabbage that Americans used to make coleslaw. Gochugaru, or red chili powder or flakes, on the other difficult to obtain ingredient was shipped to her by her sisters who lived in Korea. But not long after, my mom began purchasing kimchi in our town's only Korean market, which in addition to selling Korean grocery items not available in mainstream stores, conveniently rented out the latest Korean TV shows recorded onto VHS tapes. My mother would rent these tapes by the trunk carloads. While the store-bought kimchi was not of the best quality, given how labor-intensive kimchi making was, it was good enough for my mom. Today, Korean food, and especially kimchi, is all the rage. Major supermarkets chains now carry a number of different brands of factory-made kimchi. Health enthusiasts declare kimchi a miracle food for its probiotic qualities. It has become the new yogurt or red wine. And diners of all backgrounds seek out Korean restaurants to devour grilled meats on tabletops along with the unlimited free kimchi that comes with it. How did Korean food suddenly become so fashionable and trendy? Why is Jonah Johnson, personal chef to Leonardo DiCaprio, suddenly professing to the LA Times that he wakes up every morning craving kimchi? Why does the latest cookbook, her third, by Gwyneth Paltrow, contain a recipe for kimchi fried rice? How did Korean food go from zero to hero within a single generation, my generation? And in other words, how did kimchi end up in tacos? And how is it possible that so many people love it? The simple answer would be that Korean food tastes good. And it was just a matter of time before everyone discovered this. However, given that virtually all national cuisines have the capacity to taste good, this answer does not address the fundamental questions of why now? Why so suddenly? Now, one possible factor that has contributed to the rise of Korean food up the ladder of culinary status in the United States has been a cadre of skillful and media-savvy Korean American food personalities. As a person singularly responsible for launching 1,000 Korean taco trucks, Roy Choi has been briefly touched on already. During roughly the same time that the media anointed Choi as the face of Korean food's innovative possibilities in Los Angeles, another Korean American, David Chang, who, I don't know if you know, recently won big in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. He won $1 million. He occupied a parallel position in New York City. As the mastermind behind the Momofuku restaurant enterprise or empire, which began with Momofuku Noodle Bar in 2006, Chang has been heralded as a culinary genius by nearly every influential food critic in the country, especially the New York Times food critics. But while Choi and Chang might have garnered the most attention, many other Korean Americans chefs have gained prominence over the past decade, including, in random order, Danny Bowen, June Cha, Judy Ju, Bill Kim, Edward Kim, Hooni Kim, Christian Kish, Corey Lee, Jiyeon Lee, Edward Lee, Sarah Yu Park, Rachel Yang, and Sang Yoon. This list is significant for at least two reasons. One, it isn't anywhere near exhaustive. And two, given the extremely masculinist, if not misogynistic environment of professional kitchens, women make up a significant portion of this list. Of course, luminaries such as Julia Child, Wolfgang Puck, Emerald Lagasse, Ming Tsai, and Thomas Keller were food celebrities long before the American media discovered Korean American chefs. But while they did not originate the idea, Korean Americans have increasingly become synonymous with the notion of celebrity chefdom, perhaps more so than any other ethnically identifiable group. And given the fact that 4 Korean Americans were nominated for the James Beard Award in the year 2015 alone, which did not go unnoticed by both the US and Korean media, it appears that this trend will continue into the foreseeable future. Before this past year's James Beard Awards were canceled due to COVID, there were no less than 15 Korean American nominees on deck. Aside from the media spotlight, these highly trained chefs share another common feature. Collectively, the food they are famous for is not what anyone would call traditional Korean food, also known as hanship. So this is a spread of one type of Korean traditional table. Rather, their food is best characterized as eclectic, experimental, and innovative, which is in keeping with the training many of them received at prestigious culinary schools, the Ivies of the cooking world, if you will, such as the Culinary Institute of America, the French Culinary Institute, and Le Cordon Bleu. These are not the places you go to study if you want to learn how to master the art of traditional Korean food. Their food also reflects their experiences in working in the kitchens of some of the most celebrated restaurants in the United States, such as Le Bernardin, Café Boulud, the French Laundry, and Charlie Trotter's. Again, these are not the places to acquire work experience if you want someday to open your own place that specializes in traditional Korean food. Like Roy Choi's signature tacos, the food of these celebrity Korean American chefs are playfully and purposefully fusion, but at a high-end versions, a culinary crossroads of the world's multitudinous cuisine, often with pan-Asian sensibilities. Thus, even as they played an important role in popularizing the idea of Korean food in the United States, it would be a mischaracterization to consider these Korean American chefs as purveyors of Korean food, no matter how authentically Korean looking the plates and spoons are. To be sure, Korean food has received considerable attention over the past several years. To wit, in 2012, LA Weekly published an epic article entitled Jonathan Gold's 60 Korean Dishes Every Angelino Should Know, which included restaurant recommendations for all 60 dishes profiled. Predictably, most of the restaurants were located in Los Angeles' Koreatown, which the website Eater Los Angeles aptly describes as the Mecca of Korean cuisine that lies unparalleled in America. In fact, the Korean food in LA is considered so amazing that even people from Korea, they admit that's true, and they come to LA to eat the newest Korean food that's served there. Not to be outdone, in 2014, Pete Wells of the New York Times published his own epic article about Korean food in the borough of Queens, with detailed profile of 12 restaurants accompanied by 31 high-definition photographs that would make any fan of food porn blush. All the media attention to Korean food had the Food Republic declaring that in 2014, Korean food had a ridiculously big year in America. What is what is worth noting, however, is that the vast majority of the 5,000 or so Korean restaurants scattered around the country are not run by highly trained, famous, celebrity professional chefs, but rather by unheralded cooks, often the moms, dads, aunts, and grandmothers of Korean American families. Or, as it is increasingly the case, the job of cooking Korean food have fallen increasingly into the hands of Latino workers, who for decades have been employed by Korean American small businesses in areas with significant Mexican and other Central American labor force. This is the case not only in Los Angeles and New York, but also in Atlanta, in Annandale, Virginia, among other cities. The rising celebrity status of Korean American chefs and cooks indicates that Korean might be the latest in a long line of so-called ethnic food in America to finally arrive. As increasing numbers of Americans are exposed to the hype around Korean food, Korean restaurants have become go-to destinations for diners curious about the taste of, say, pajeon or posam. Moreover, those who wish to try their hands at making these dishes at home can choose from nearly over 50 English language Korean cookbooks published since 2013. And they're all, of course, on Amazon.com. But as many Americans discover Korean food for the first time, it is perhaps important to remember that the single biggest consumer group has always been and continues to be Korean Americans, which today numbers to about 1.7 million. Well, restaurants are where non-Koreans most commonly encounter Korean food. For Korean Americans, it is at their homes. The problem my mother faced 3 or 4 decades ago, procuring Korean grocery items, is now a distant memory. And she now has to drive less than 30 minutes from her home in rural Georgia to find a well-stocked Korean market. In Binghamton, New York, where I currently live, most of the essential ingredients needed to make a variety of Korean dishes are regularly available at, of course, Wegmans Market, just a quick 10-minute drive from my home. Along with several different brands of kimchi, gochujang, and other essentials, Wegmans carry a variety of instant ramen, which is consumed in such large quantities by Koreans everywhere that it is considered their second rice. It is where I pick up my weekly supply of Shin ramen, my favorite brand, along with my favorite brand of shrimp crackers. Both are products of Nongshim, one of South Korea's largest food companies. In fact, Wegmans carries no less than 23 different Nongshim products when I checked a couple of years ago. Nongshim's growing presence in the United States leads us to consider another possible factor that has contributed to the rise of Korean food's popularity: the transnational dimension of national and corporate leverage and power. I began this talk by telling you about what a nervous wreck I was leading up to the 2016 election night. For the past 4 years, my nervousness had been taken over by utter misery and despair. Whatever fear I had about the horrors of the impending Trump presidency, the reality had turned out to be far worse. I literally wake up every morning with a knot in my gut, like this morning. Still, even though Joe Biden has easily won the election, my despair has reached the point where I dread reading or watching the news. I don't want to know what awful things Trump and his racist, seditionist minions are up to next. In practical terms, what this has meant is that I've stopped or paused from watching MSNBC. So now that I have tuned out Joy Reid, Chris Hayes, Rachel Maddow, and Lawrence O'Donnell, which translates to 4 hours a night and 20 hours a week, you might wonder, what am I doing? Well, what am I doing with all this extra time in my hands? Why? Doubling down on my dose of Korean popular culture, of course. In addition to the 2 hours and hours of additional time spent watching K-pop, I don't know if you guys listen to K-pop, maybe some of you do, on videos on YouTube, I subscribe to 3 online sites that stream an endless procession of Korean culture programming. Here's one of the K-pop, Momoland they're called, singing Boom Boom's a very popular Korean song. 3 streaming sites that stream Korean programming: Viki, On Demand Korea, and yes, Netflix. This means that I not only get to watch practically any Korean dramas, TV dramas I want, both recent such as Itaewon Class and classics such as Winter Sonata, but also get to overdose on Korean singing shows because I love singing, like singing karaoke, such as Fantastic Duo, Hidden Singer, I Can See Your Voice. In fact, Masked Singer on Fox TV is actually originally a Korean show that they adapted in here in the United States. Then there are the food shows. In recent years, programs that feature people cooking, eating, and talking endlessly about food have dominated the Korean media. Graphic scenes of young, beautiful Koreans eating luscious Korean food, televised not in just HD, but 8K resolution, have become a narrative mainstay of Korean TV dramas. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Korea is currently afflicted with a major case of food obsession. The proliferation of what is called mukbang, or eating broadcast, in which viewers tune in to watch and interact with other people eating a ridiculous amount of food on live streaming video, is just one manifestation of this obsession. Another manifestation is this guy. His name is Jung Won-baek, who is basically the Korean version of Julia Child, Emerald Lagasse, Rachel Ray, Bobby Flay, KFC, Pizza Hut, and Starbucks all rolled into one. Due to the remarkable staying power, if not escalation, of what is called the Korean wave, the current Korean food obsession is now being transmitted around the world. From Vietnam to Indonesia, from Mexico to Saudi Arabia, servings of TV shows such as Descendants of the Sun and Goblin are accompanied by sides of kimchi and tteokbokki, which is one of the most favorite street foods in Korea, and mouthful of Blackpink and BTS. You might have heard of BTS. They're the biggest band right now who's gone, from K-pop, are chased down by shots of beer mixed with soju, which in Korean is called somek. This past decade, dramatic rise in tourists to Korea, particularly from China, who represented nearly half of the 14 million foreign visitors to Korea each year, can be attributed in large part to the global transmission of Korean popular culture, which conspicuously includes gastronomic culture. Of course, it's not just China that has been, to use a mixed metaphor, bitten by the Korean wave fever. The United States has also caught the fever, not only the K-pop and K-drama bugs, but also the Korean food bug, which is indicated not only by the success of Nongshim products such as Noguri, Chapagetti, and Shin Ramen, but also the increasing visibility of, say, the CJ food conglomerate. And you might have seen the Bibigo label that's now in a lot of stores in the US. Coincidentally or not, while Korean American chefs like Roy Choi and David Chang were receiving accolades for their deliciously inventive, if not radically transformative, approach to Korean food, the decidedly conservative forces of what is called the soft power of gastrodiplomacy, headlined by kimchi and traditional Korean food, were hard at work bringing a more traditional version of Korean food to the US and anywhere else that was willing to open their stomachs and wallets. In 2009, under the direct order of President Myung-Bak Lee, who is on the left there, and in the middle is the First Lady, Yoon Oh-kim, the Korean government began an ambitious, if not ambiguous, campaign to elevate traditional Korean food to one of the top 5 cuisines of the world by the year 2017. And I don't know how it was successful, but it was actually made quite an inroad. In real terms, the goal was to increase the number of overseas Korean restaurants from about 10,000 to 40,000 to establish at least 100 high-end traditional Korean restaurants around the world, and to more than double the export of Korean agriculture and seed products from roughly $4.4 billion to $10 billion. What this entailed was the creation of various government-funded organizations, foundations, and initiatives designed to spread the gospel of Korean food around the world. In this regard, the Korean Food Initiative was part of the larger Korean Wave project, as the Korean government and corporations partnered to turn Korean culture into exportable products. So just as there are Samsung cars and Samsung phones and Hyundai cars that are exported, so are Korean culture, say music, TV shows, and food. The traditional Korean food globalization effort also entailed a coordinated effort to standardize Korean food, which became an important step in laying down the groundwork of industrial level production and export of Korean food. The government established culinary schools in a number of countries, created a recipe manual that was distributed to overseas Korean restaurants, and registered the standard recipes of important staples such as kimchi, gochujang, and doenjang with the Codex Alimentarius of the United Nations, which, as you know, is sort of the Supreme Court of world food distribution. To ensure the success of the Korean Food Initiative, in 2010, the First Lady, Yoon Kim, made a series of overseas visits, including taking part in a well-publicized Korean food event in the New York City area with the American veterans of the Korean War. Joining the First Lady, who made seafood pancakes or pajeon for the veterans, were the Korean-American actress Moon Bloodgood, chef Jean-Georges Vangerhoekten. You see him right in the background there with the apron on behind the shoulder, right, of the First Lady, and Marja Vangerhoekten, the wife of Jean-Georges and star of Kimchi Chronicles, a 13-part PBS series about Korean food that aired in 2011. What drew even greater media attention the same year in Korea was an event which featured the First Lady not only in which the First Lady not only handmade kimchi but also hand-fed kimchi to Miyuki Hatoyama, the wife of the Japanese prime minister of the time. By the way, the Korean president at the time, Moon Baek-lee, is currently in prison for corruption, as is the president previous to him. Her name is Park Geun-hye Park, also currently in prison. So maybe there is hope for Trump after all. So how did kimchi end up in tacos? If Donald Trump's proposed wall ever gets built, does that mean we have to take kimchi out of tacos? Or worse yet, deport all tacos south of the wall? Does the Korean taco portend the culinary apocalypse? That is to say, the end of so-called authentic Korean or Mexican food as we know it? Or does it herald a future of borderless, but nonetheless delicious gastronomic fusion? The answer to these questions rests first and foremost on understanding the current state of Korean food in America. This means not only assessing the contribution of prominent Korean American chefs and cooks and the influence of the Korean wave, as I try to do today, but also traveling back in time more than a century to the earliest days of the Korean immigration to see how Korean Americans coped with the pressures of culinary assimilation, adaptation, coercion, and resistance. Most Korean Americans do not eat Korean food because it is suddenly hip or trendy to do so. For as long as we have lived in the United States, Korean food has been, and it continues to be, just common everyday fare. Food that has meant, for better or for worse, home, family, community. And it has been this way since the arrival of the first significant wave of Koreans to Hawaii and the United States a century ago. What did Koreans in the 1930s Los Angeles eat when there were no H-Marts, a very big Korean grocery store that's not everywhere in the United States? What did the scores of Korean women who married American GIs cook for their husbands when they were brought to live in the American heartlands and hinterlands after the Korean War? How did the thousands of Korean adoptees who grew up in white families react when they first tasted kimchi for the first time? How did the 1965 Immigration Act alter the culinary map of the United States? And how have Korean Americans contributed to the redrawing of the new map? To date, neither scholars of Korean American studies or food studies have significantly addressed these questions. It is my hope that future scholars take up these questions and do them justice. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, in order to understand why there is suddenly kimchi in tacos, we need to come to terms with the reality that no matter how tall, powerful, and beautiful it might be, no wall is impenetrable. The very existence of the Korean taco, I believe, is evidence of this. An inherent feature of all walls, borders, and boundaries is their permeability. Things have a way of going around, jumping over, and seeping through barriers, be they natural or man-made. And in today's digitized world, in which nothing is more anachronistic than physical walls, things easily teleport back and forth, no matter how secure the firewall. In the words of Martin Luther King, after visiting the Berlin Wall on September 13, 1964, which was actually 2 days after I was born. I was born in 9/11, 1964. Here's what he said in Berlin. For here, on either side of the wall, are God's children, and no man-made barrier can obliterate that fact. Whether it be east or west, men and women search for meaning, hope for fulfillment, yearn for faith in something beyond themselves, and cry desperately for love and community to supper them through this pilgrim journey. If you need more than the word of the Reverend to convince you of this, then here is another quote from another prominent American. I tell you, to me, the second most important thing, I don't know what the first is, but second most important thing after love is most important. What you do is never, ever give up. Don't give up. Don't allow it to happen. If there is a concrete wall in front of you, go through it, go over it, go around it, but get to the other side of the wall. Who uttered these words, you ask? I'm sure you can guess. Well, it was Donald Trump himself. During the commencement address he gave at Wagner College in Staten Island in May 2004. In order to grasp the true meaning of the Korean taco truck or the taco, we must come to terms with the fact that of all the types of borders that can be imagined or erected, the least powerful of them are the ones built on political fear and loathing. Whether we talk about the movement of peoples, ideas, or things, such as delicious and stinky kimchi, walls can never keep a good taco down. People who find themselves far from their place of origin must cope with and adjust to the particularities of a foreign environment. Survival is contingent upon not only the degree to which they can successfully navigate, but also manipulate their surroundings to suit their needs. Of course, of paramount importance is economic survival. Not to be underestimated, however, is the importance of cultural survival. And a fundamental aspect of culture, everyday lived culture, is diet. Everyone, after all, must eat to survive, and if at all possible, eat the food that we love, which is often the food we grew up on. In this regard, the famous food adage, tell me what you are and I'll tell me what you eat and I'll tell you what you are, is true for Korean Americans as it is for all other Americans, be they citizens or immigrants, documented or undocumented. And knowing this makes me sleep a little bit easier during this nightmarish end of the Trump presidency. Thank you. So I will now unshare.
Okay. Bingo. Okay, we're back.
Okay.
I noticed there were a few questions that were entered in the chat, just general questions, I think. Can you see them, Robert, or should I?
Yes. Greetings, Robert from, well, oh, who is that? Angela? Angela, maybe could you unmute and maybe greet me in person? There we go.
Hi. Well,
And so
I
what is
just
your
tickled that
question?
you are a fellow alum. But I'm
Oh,
an old alum from
you're
when
an
it used
alum.
from when the SUNY Binghamton, the undergraduate division, used to be called Harper College instead of Binghamton University.
Well, Harper College is still the college that I'm in. It is still,
They still call it
yeah,
this.
we call
Oh,
it Harper
great,
College.
great.
Yes. What
Yeah.
major
Are you-
were you? What department were you in?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Experimental Psychology and a
Oh,
minor in art history, and I completed only a BS, and then
yeah,
I
my,
moved
my,
on.
yeah, my wife is a professor of art history at Binghamton.
What did you say about the
My
professor?
wife is a art history.
Your wife? Oh,
yeah, she's a
cool.
art
Cool.
history professor at Binghamton. So,
And my interest in art history inclined, which I'm still very active in, although not as a scholar, but in other things I do. But they incline toward the 15, 16, 1700s. So may I ask you about what was Korean food like in the 15, 16, 1700s?
quite different. I wasn't there at the time, but from my research,
Well, I almost was, but I was just a tot.
I don't think you're that much older than I am, or maybe you're younger than I am, or maybe we're similar. But Korean food has undergone tremendous change, like all cuisines, for a variety of factors. The biggest contribution to change for Korean is, of course, foreign incursions or invasions or encounters. So the Mongol invasions, the Chinese associations, the Japanese invasions, followed by the Japanese occupation. So, and also changes in religion from mostly, say, shamanism to Buddhism and then Christianity. All of these brought tremendous changes in the diet. So I would venture to guess that in the 15th, 16th centuries, food then would be unrecognizable today. Some have remained. There was kimchi, say, back then as well, but the chili didn't make it to Korea until the 16th century. And so
Wow, big difference.
for hundreds of years, kimchi was without chili. Now, of course, it's chili is one of the main ingredients.
Can you imagine such a thing? Kimchi without chili?
Well, there are many kimchis currently without chilies. There are, by some estimation, over 200 types of kimchi, and many of them don't include chilies. There's in fact what they call white kimchi, that is just basically a brine and without any chilies. So there's still a lot of different varieties.
Are there places that Americans can taste so wide a variety of kimchis?
Yes, right now, if you're in the DC area, Annandale has amazing restaurants.
Yes, I'm
Stores,
somewhat
and they have
acquainted with
amazing
the
stores.
Korean restaurants in
Yeah.
Annandale.
Yeah, I'm sure you can easily find some there.
Very nice talking to you. Thanks
Same
for
here.
the
Thank you so much.
presentation.
I see Cece has the next chat question or comment. Cece, you want to unmute and
I just typed it in there, so just take it from my chat comment.
okay. At what point in time is Korean food considered authentic? Since so many of the ingredients, including chili, came from New World. Yeah, well, in my book that I was supposed to talk about, which I didn't today, Dubious Gastronomy, my whole argument is that the idea of authenticity is this elusive thing, like the white whale, or like Godot. We're always waiting for it, but it never arrives. Because authenticity is something we conjure up when we believe something has passed its sort of due date. So when things go in decline, when things seem to disappear, when things undergo change, I think the conservative forces against change want to retain some familiarity with their own sense of what is true. And I think the idea of authentic is used to try to limit change. It's also used, I think, as a marketing ploy. For many immigrants who open up restaurants, say restaurants of their home country, they use the word authentic to get customers. Now, what they serve can be innovative, can look nothing like the food that they grew up with, but the idea of authenticity is very much, it lures people into the eatery because it promises something pleasurable. So I would myself not use the word authentic to talk about something real. So your question might be similar to maybe the one that was asked by Angela about what food was like in the past versus what is now. It's hard to keep up. I think as American food is hard to, America's only 200 years old, 250 years old, right, as a nation. Korea as an entity goes back 1,000 years. And I would venture to argue that Korean food has undergone as much change, much fusion, which eventually, all traditional foods, all authentic foods were once fusion food, right? So I would venture to guess that it's still ongoing. In fact, the past 10 years, Korean food has undergone tremendous transformations. However, and that's mainly because of the wealth of the nation. Korea has gone from being one of the poorest countries. When I was born in 1964, I was born in Korea. Korea was considered among the poorest places on earth. North Korea was considered more promising and more prosperous because North Korea had all the hard industries, whereas South Korea didn't. And so the economic prospect of South Korea was like you might consider what Afghanistan was 10 years ago and still might be. But today, in less than my generation, I'm still alive, Korea is now the top 10 economy of the world, which means that Koreans have gone from the poorest to among the richest people on earth, which means that the food has similarly undergone similar kinds of change. Went from hunger and need and nothing to eat to now there's an abundance of food, so abundant that people, that's why the food obsession is so real in Korea. Everyone trying to come up with the next new thing. But in Korea, people don't consider this new innovation to be not Korean food. They accept it as Korean food, even though it changes, like things like cheese. Now there's cheese in everything. And Koreans don't miss a beat. They think this is not the new next thing that we see for ourselves, who we are. So I think food reflects who we are at a given moment. And what the food is today is a product of what led to it, which means for Korea, war, famine, colonization, liberation, division, immigration, migration, on and on and on. And the food reflects all of those qualities. I see Randy Clark has a question. Does Randy want to unmute and ask it in like real life?
Yeah,
Hi, Randy.
Robert, I'm going to deviate from my question.
Okay.
I'm a regular maker of kimchi. I have for a number of years. Am I guilty of cultural appropriation?
No. You will be, no, not at all. You might be guilty of it if you are, say, the corporate bigwig of Shake Shack, and you decide to market the Korean chicken sandwich without consulting any Korean, cultural producers. On your own, you decide to market such a thing. Or like TGI Fridays that I mentioned in my talk in 2010. They sold Korean tacos, and there's nothing Korean about it. I think that's an example of appropriation. I grew up in Hawaii. When hotels, right, have tourists come, they have these hula shows, these luau's. That to me is cultural appropriation, where you take something sacred to the Hawaiian people and you turn it into a cartoon for the pleasure of tourists and profit, which will force Hawaiian native young people, the friends I grew up with, to see that the only the primary way they can get out of their, say, working class background or to make any kind of living is to enter into the tourist industry, and they themselves turn their brown bodies into an object of the tourist gaze. To me, that is appropriation. Now, if you're going to do that, I would say, yes, maybe you should rethink that. But if you're making kimchi at home, like I make, say, pizza at home, I'm not Italian, I don't think we're appropriating anything.
Yeah. Well, yeah, my other question, my original question was just the nature of dubious foods. I think I kind of prefer dubious foods, with one exception that I wrote about that was a notorious favorite of one of our leaders, was well done steak with ketchup. If you know who, I think you probably know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
But seriously, what do you think, what are the American dubious foods so far as you see?
I think I think almost all American foods are dubious, but one comes to mind immediately. Top 5 dubious food: General Tso's chicken. Or going back in time, chop suey.
Yeah.
Right? Or Caesar salad. Or steak of the Alfredo sauce. I mean, Americans are basically dubious people. We are mutts. We are mongrels. We are a product of the world coming here and forming this amazing place. The most, on the one hand, hospitable, tolerant, democratic, welcoming place imaginable that has enabled me to go from being a poor Korean kid in the streets of Incheon to being a professor of Binghamton University and being able to see all of you via Zoom today. On the other hand, the United States has been one of the least hospitable, the most racist, the most horrific place for newcomers imaginable. What happened to Native Americans, what happened to African Americans, what happened to the Chinese, to the Italians, to Jews, you name it, to Catholics, to gays and lesbians, women. So it is this push and pull. And I think we are still involved in this push and pull of what's so amazing about America and what is so horrible about America. And yesterday to me is where what is so horrible has won out. But it's a continuous struggle. So I don't want to harp on just what happened yesterday, but I want to look positively and more optimistic to the future for my children to be able to say, when given the chance, that they're living in a place and an era where this is the best place on earth, right? So I think the food of America reflects all of that. You have some horrible food. Binghamton has horrible restaurants. I don't know, it's so depressingly bad. But there are places, I'd love to eat out. So that's what I miss the most. They're amazing food, right? So General Tso chicken, the burrito. There's no burritos in Mexico, but guess what? It's delicious, right? The contributions of all Americans of all backgrounds, of people from Southern Italy who created the red sauce and the Parmesan and all that stuff. I love all that stuff. But my Italian friend from Rome, who's recently from Rome, she thinks it's just horrendous what the Americans eat in terms of Italian food, right? She wouldn't go near, say, something covered with cheese and with the red sauce. So Randy, my answer would be everything and nothing, right? Let's see, Susan Barocas. You want to unmute and second also say hello? Is Susan here?
There's always 2 Susans.
Oh, Susan Barocas.
That's not me.
Okay, well, I just read the question. Fascinating talk, would like to think about. Sorry, I have to jump off. Oh, she left. She looks forward to later. Okay, okay, got to have sort of been in your presence, Susan. Next is Margie Gibson.
I'm here.
If you could unmute if you're here.
I'm here.
Hi, Marjorie.
I had a couple of questions. First of all, in Korea, do people make kimchi at home, or is it something that's only bought at a store?
It's increasingly store-bought, although the practice has really gone down, because kimchi making, as Randy probably knows, is a tremendously time-consuming and difficult activity. Historically, traditionally, kimchi making was in the hands of Korean women who together as a community, whether as family or either as in the town or village or neighborhood, would get together usually during the fall season and do what's called kimjang, which is the kimchi making sort of moment. And so each kimchi made by different people from block to block, village to village, town to town, city to city would be very different, right? But with more and more women over the past decades entering the workforce, like the United States, Korean women, like American women, have to work full-time jobs, both in the workplace and at home, right? Even though they work full-time, wherever they may be, they still at home, still have to do most of the domestic work. And so kimchi making is so time-consuming that now they simply go out and buy it. And you can buy all kinds of kimchi of all varieties and of all actually levels. You can buy really cheap kimchi, they call it Chinese export, import, or you can buy kimchi at the most exclusive and high-end department stores. So I don't know, what's the high-end department store anymore? Neiman Marcus. So the Neiman Marcus of Korea will have a basement, a food court, a supermarket, where they would have the most expensive kimchi, and all the well-heeled people buy kimchi from the supermarket, from the department stores, luxury department stores. So you can get Gucci bags with kimchi, right? But increasingly, more people are making kimchi, are not making kimchi at home, but that's also changing somewhat the cycle. As more and more people recognize that the traditional kimchi making art at home is dying down, there is a movement to rediscover homemade kimchi. So you have now, of course, that happening as well.
And the white kimchi, how does that compare to sauerkraut?
Oh, well, sauerkraut generally is really, really aged, right? The cabbage is all usually, julienne or right, and it's full of like spices that is more perhaps European, such as what goes into sauerkraut. That's
when you make it, nothing. It's just salt.
Yeah,
the cabbage layered with salt, and then when you cook it, you might put in juniper berries or
juniper.
caraway.
Yes, right. So so Korean white kimchi is not that different, although the liquid, there's a broth or juice which is very fresh tasting. It's like drinking. I mean, people love to drink kimchi juice. I don't know if any of you have done that. When you have a jar of kimchi, you know that it's alive, right? Kimchi is like wine. It's living, and oftentimes there's bubbles on top if you have a jar because it's still fermenting. It's like champagne. You uncork it and you can drink the kimchi juice, and it's so refreshing. And so it's like red wine, white wine. White kimchi is like white wine. It has different kind of notes. It has no chilies and less smell, usually less fermented. The traditional like Napa cabbage kimchi is the one that you most commonly see. That also is eaten in many different kinds of stages. Some like it really fresh. I love it when my mom made kimchi when I was a kid, and she would just put kimchi in my mouth as she's making it. That was it's like a salad. Whereas some people like it aged maybe for a week or a day. Other people like it aged for a month. Some people like it aged for a year. And also kimchi is also not only a food, a dish, but it's also an ingredient. Almost half the food in Korean cuisine has kimchi as an ingredient, like kimchi stew, kimchi stir fry, kimchi rice. I mean, there's on and on and on. So it's hard to generalize about kimchi.
The, in grocery stores here in Germany, you can buy bottles of sauerkraut juice.
In fact, many Koreans who have traveled to Germany and other places in Europe who cannot find a Korean restaurant would eat sauerkraut as kimchi. It's a
Yeah.
thing, actually,
Yeah,
because it is very similar.
okay.
So sauerkraut is similar to one type of kimchi, but there are endless types of kimchi. There are some kimchi that is made with animal protein. In the southern part of Korea, many kimchi is seafood kimchi with squids and with octopus and with crab. In fact, there's some kimchi historically that was made with pheasant. Right? So kimchi is not there's in my book Dubious Gastronomy, I asked the question, what makes kimchi kimchi? And it's hard to answer that question. But to me, it is the brine. It is the salt. Seems to be more fundamental. It's a pickle, right? Pickle is one of the oldest forms of food preservation. You have a hole in the ground. You stick something in it. You ferment it, right? So curing, salting, smoking, fermenting. These are all timeless, I think, techniques of food preservation, which, lucky for us, enhances the taste. Something wonderful about, say, a salami, which is different from fresh meat because it's fermented and aged. And I think that's the beauty. That newer preservation techniques, such as canning and freezing, is not the same because they ruin the taste of food. That's why we have MSG to revitalize the taste of mass-produced, right? Factory-produced foods has to have MSG because MSG magically puts the flavor back. But traditional foods, just cured foods of the past, don't need MSG because it's already amazing by itself. I prefer actually lox over, say, fresh salmon, right? Because you know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Susan Tucker. Does Susan have a question? Or I can just read it. Very good talk, thank you. In New Orleans, there are Korean po' boys. Wow, maybe as well as tacos, but I'm not seeing the latter. In the light of that and what you say about nation building, is social cohesion helped by finding foods and names for them unique to one place? Absolutely, yes. I've only been to New Orleans once, but I understand that one of the things about New Orleans is the Vietnamese community. And same with, say, with Houston. The Vietnamese refugees who came to this country in large numbers beginning in the 1970s after the fall of Saigon, in various waves. The initial wave came right after the fall of Saigon, and they were actually better, more middle class, more associated with American military, American companies, and they came to the United States and they settled. But then subsequently, you had the boat people, right? Those who suffered under the communist regime who escaped. Many of them, most of them were actually Chinese ethnics who escaped. Many of them settled in the United States or anywhere that would have them. And they ended up in places like, of course, the mothership would be Orange County, California, Westminster, California, but other places, New Orleans and Houston are other sort of meccas of Vietnamese communities. And they have really done an amazing job in fusing the local food tradition. A lot of it has to do with African-American foodways, right? So soul food, Southern food that is now paired with these newer immigrants from Asia. And so there are, I mean, I can see Korean po' boy, there are Vietnamese po' boys. One of the famous foods of, I think, Houston is the crawfish that is done in Vietnamese style that is now widely popular. So yes, absolutely. I think place makes meaning, and foods undergo change in a very localized way, which is a global process as well. And yes, I would absolutely agree with you that place is vitally important. Okay, Rob here? Okay, his question is, if I go to a Korean restaurant for the first time, what dishes do you recommend? Well, it depends on what you like. I would say the gateway Korean foods, like if you never had Japanese food before, I think eating a raw piece of tuna or like sea urchin might be too much for you, right? So you might want to start with chicken teriyaki or the California roll. Korean food, I would say, is the grilled meats. Korean barbecue is universally, no one I know, unless you're vegetarian, no one I know dislikes Korean grilled food. So kalbi, which is Korean ribs marinated in soy sauce, in garlic and ginger, and usually like pureed pear or kiwi as a agent to break down the meat, grilled, or bulgogi, which is more thinly sliced meat, or today the biggest rage. And if you have a chance, watch Netflix. There's a brand new show that came out with you remember I showed you the most famous celebrity chef of Korea, Baek Jung-won? He has a Netflix show with 2 episodes called Pork Belly Rhapsody. You can watch it now, right? Pork Belly Rhapsody, where 2 parts, and each part delves into his argument, which is that the pork is the most important, among the most important food of Korean cuisine. And he demonstrates various ways in which Koreans have eaten pork. And so one of the most popular ways of eating Korean food is pork belly, grilled over live coal, and you wrap it in, very much like Vietnamese food. You wrap it in all this lettuce and different kinds of herbs, along with, I'm making my mouth water now, with like the chili paste and with raw garlic and chilies, on and on, you know? So I would go with the barbecue. And if you prefer something more vegetarian or something full of vegetables, another gateway food that you have in the airlines, if you fly to Korea in a Korean Air, like Korean Air or Asiana Airlines, the 2 Korean national airlines, they will serve you as an option bibimbap or mixed rice, a bowl of rice with all kinds of what they call namu, or different types of vegetables that's been sort of made into salads. And it's all mixed together with the hot chili paste and sesame oil. And I would say that's another very popular Korean food. But Korean food goes great with alcohol. So beer is amazing with it. Has to be lagers or pilsners. None of these like, you know, IPAs, none of that stuff. The most light beer you can find, and soju, which is a distilled liquor of about 20 proof, which is the national perhaps drink of Korea. Very cheap, like $2 a pop for the small jar in regular stores, or what they call makgeolli, which is rice. It's like sake, but not filtered. So it's like milky, creamy. Korean food, I think, has to go with all these alcohols. So, so Pixie Millet says that was a wonderful talk. Thank you, Pixie. You have a question? Okay. And that's all I see in the text chat.
Oh, yeah.
Or did I miss anything?
Okay, Pixie, you were muted. I just unmuted you. So.
Oh yeah, thanks. Oh yes, it's a great presentation. I liked how you brought in so many different things. It was entertaining and humorous and insightful and very informative. Just great.
Thank you so much.
It was really good.
I see hand, Claudia.
Yeah, I'm wondering about if you have any thoughts about Korean corner groceries turning into supermarkets and their influence in popularizing Korean food.
It might, well, Korean food is interesting is because the first Korean restaurants in America were not intended for non-Koreans, and first Korean businesses had never really intended for non-Koreans to as customers. What separates, say, the Chinese or Japanese even, or many other immigrant groups from Koreans is that Koreans, but maybe this is not so different from many ethnic groups. Initially, the first wave of Korean immigration in different waves, different stages, had businesses that would cater toward co-ethnics. And it took a long time for Korean cultural items to be discovered by non-Koreans. And I think that's where we are right now. So if there is in your neighborhood a small Korean grocer, which has now become bigger, and now you have non-Koreans as customers as well, that is a trend that I think is very much in keeping with the American experience.
Yeah.
Right. So, so your question, I kind of lost the thread of your question. Is
Well, no, that's basically it. I mean, that's sort of my experience is, you know, the new Korean grocery store opened in the town. I went to check it out, and it was interesting to me how many different kinds of people were there.
Yeah.
And they were responding to the fresh produce. I mean, I would see like Indian women, Jamaican women, European women around the okra, and all choosing it different ways. It was really interesting to see.
Yeah, if nothing else, immigrant entrepreneurs are very, very savvy. They need to survive. So in my neighborhood, there is one Korean market called Kim's Oriental Grocery. And when I first moved to Binghamton in 2005, they basically, it's a small room, maybe 400 square feet or so. They only had Korean grocery items. Over time, in the time that I was here, they split it in half. So one half of the store is Korean grocery items. The other half are South Asian or Indian or Pakistani grocery items, because the couple who owns the store understood that those were the two customers that she could cultivate. Because Binghamton is a university town, and because South Asians, Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, Sri Lankans are a large sector of our university environment, they have families and so forth, they need a place to go. And so Kim's Oriental Grocery was very savvy, very early on in learning about Indian grocery. She studied and she joined the Grocers Association of Indian Foods and whatnot. And now when I go to her store to get, well, I love Indian food. I cook Indian food at home all the time. So that's my one-stop stopping. I get my Korean ingredients and I also get my Indian food ingredients. And so, yeah, I think that's how, you know.
Just one more observation about those grocery stores. You know, in an American grocery store, you would go to one aisle and you would find the rice. But in these stores, you go to different rice is in different aisles. And so Japanese rice is in one aisle, Indian rice in another, Latin, you know, Hispanic rice in another aisle. I just thought that was interesting.
Well, the variety of rices, I think, is one of the most amazing things in the world. Because people keep talking about how rice is so Asian, as you all know, it isn't, right? If you're Italian, if you're Spanish, if you're Middle Eastern, if you're Latin American, rice is central. The Carolina rice and so forth. The Korean rice that we eat on a daily basis is the same rice that Japanese eat. It's a short grain, right, variety. Right. Chinese rice is usually jasmine rice, oftentimes, which is longer grain, very aromatic, which is different from the basmati rice, as you all know, right? On and on and on. So I think it's, yeah, I think it's one. So in my cupboard, I might have 5 or 6 different types of rices at a given time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay. Ellen Peltz.
Hi, yes, you got
Hi.
it right. Thank you. I
Your
really enjoyed
question
the talk.
is?
You've made me really hungry. I'm curious about, I've been drinking barley tea
Yeah, that's Korean.
now and I really love it. But listening to your talk, I'm beginning to wonder, is it the real thing?
Well, if it's barley and you make tea, it's a real thing.
Okay.
What
I
question?
mean, as in terms of authentic Korean, is it, do people in Korea really drink it?
Yes, yes, yes. Barley tea or nokcha is something that is very common. In fact, if you go to restaurants, instead of water, they may give you a picture of barley tea.
Oh, interesting.
In fact, at my home growing up, my mom would always have a picture of barley tea, either in the fridge, or you can also drink it hot or cold. But Korean also make tea with corn.
Yes, I've had that also. And
Yeah.
I was told it's better in the wintertime. It keeps you warm.
Well, I think all teas, well, hot water should keep you warm. But
Yeah.
Koreans have a philosophy where in the summer, you eat really scalding and spicy foods, because by eating both temperature hot and taste hot foods, your body temperature rises, you perspire, and then you cool down. So that is and so in my first book, Dubious Gastronomy, I wrote about one chapter on dog meat. And what's interesting about dog meat is that in China, people typically eat it during the winter months because it keeps you warm, they say. Koreans eat dog meat during the summer months because it keeps you warm. So it's the same kind of principle, health principle, but they practice it in different seasons. So yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Let's see. Do your Indian friends approve of the Indian dishes? Randy, you wanna expand on that question?
Well, as I concluded, it really doesn't matter if you like them. This is what we were talking about, cultural appropriation earlier. But yeah, I started cooking with doing Indian cooking, and God knows where it's evolved.
Yeah.
Because it's now probably my version of Indian cooking, but I like it a lot.
Well, you know, I don't know if you ever seen the movie called Harold and Kumar Goes to White Castle. Do any of you know this movie? Harold and Kumar Goes to White Castle. It's like 20 years old, maybe even longer than that. There are two characters, Kumar, who's an Indian American, and Harold, who's a Korean American, best friends. They like to get high, smoke weed, get high. They decide one night to go to White Castle. And then they have this adventure as they crisscross America, basically, and meet up all these different characters. Koreans and South Asians have this bond in the United States. I have many Kumars in my life. But anyway, so at Binghamton University, I have so many friends who happen to be South Asian. And many of them are women and men as well. But many of them don't cook, right? Because a lot of academics don't cook because they don't, especially women. They don't cook. This generation, I think maybe more men cook than women. I don't know. But so I often have over to my house before COVID, my South Asian friends, and I will make them Indian food because they don't make it at home. And the Indian restaurants in town are terrible. My Indian food is so much better. And so they all are so thankful. And they acknowledge that it's not their mom's cooking. It's not the food they grew up with, because I'm cooking from cookbooks, right? And if you know the history of Indian food in America, most Indian restaurants in America only serve a very narrow band of what is Indian food, right? As you know, the term curry doesn't exist in India. Curry is a term that the Europeans use to try to flatten the diversity of South Asia's food, right? So if you're of South Asian heritage, curry makes no sense because everything is curry if you're like a Brit, right? So in America, when Indian restaurants first began to pop up, they were actually operated by Bangladeshis. immigrants and not by Indians and Bangladeshis who realized that by cooking the food of northern India, what they call Mughlai food, food of the Mughal, former Mughal Empire, right? If they serve that in restaurants, they'll get a wide customer. So you have most Indian restaurants you find in small towns or big cities in America that is not in Indian neighborhoods serve one type of Indian food. So when I'm cooking Indian food, I have these cookbooks from all regions of India and South Asia. And so my Indian friends, I try to like surprise them by cooking a dish from their home state, say Kerala or whatever it may be. And they really appreciate my effort, right? I'm not gonna sell it. I'm not gonna open a restaurant. I'm not that, glutton for punishment. So yeah, I think to me, it's a great thing,
Yeah, I started with the Time Life Indian cooking.
Yeah, I have maybe 24 Indian cook. I have a big collection of Indian. I collect cookbooks, and so I have so many Indian cookbooks. Madder Joffrey's are among the earliest that I've owned.
Oh, yeah.
She was, I think, a real pioneer of Indian, introducing Indian food to Americans in this country. Okay, let's see. Judith, Martha,
Yes,
you have a question?
Yeah, Heather, I was really reflecting on a recent talk that we had with Paul Friedman from Yale about American cuisine and how it got that way. And then I was thinking about the movie In Search of Israeli Cuisine with Michael Solomonoff, where he went searching to see if there is such a thing as Israeli cuisine.
I don't know that movie.
Oh, you must.
I have to check it out. Yeah.
It's on Netflix. It will drive you mad. You'll come away enormously hungry. And of course, Israel is another country where people have settled from all over the world, bringing their influences of various kinds and so forth. And it just makes me think about, and this conversation about authenticity and is there such a thing? And I'm just wondering, with travel and curiosity, and as we look at and take bits and pieces of cuisines from other places and adapt it to our own circumstances, is there such a thing as so-called authenticity? Does that even begin to exist? And will it in the future, or will it be some new amalgam that is altogether different?
Yeah, I think the idea of traditional foods is something I can mentally wrap around my head around. How have food been prepared traditionally? But the question of authenticity to me is impossible to pin down. So I do my best to avoid any discussion of authenticity. I think the idea of authenticity belongs in a museum. It's something that is preserved in like formaldehyde, to keep it from changing. There's, I think, great fear. Immigrants oftentimes talk about authenticity of their food because they have undergone tremendous upheaval. To immigrate to this, like I immigrated as a 8-year-old. So my adjustment is different from my parents who immigrated when they were in their 30s. Right. They had tremendous struggle adapting, assimilating, learning the language, learning, on and on and on, right? It was a shattering experience. And what could they hold on to as something that was stable, meaningful, that gave them a sense of home, is that they preserved Koreanness. So oftentimes, immigrant communities in the United States and other diasporic locations have maintained an old-fashioned traditional lifestyle that's a country that they left long ago abandoned. So there's stories about how Japanese who came for business to America in 1980s and 70s, many Japanese businessmen, mostly men, came to America. If you remember the 80s, there was all that fear of Japanese taking over American economy, buying up, everything, right? Remember all that Japanese fear?
Yep.
The movie Gung Ho and all that stuff. A lot of Japanese businessmen who'd never been to America would come to the United States go to LA, for instance, and look for something familiar. And there were already Japanese American, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei, third, fourth, fifth generation communities of Japanese Americans who had in neighborhoods like Little Tokyo. So they would go to Little Tokyo in downtown LA to eat Japanese food. Then they would be shocked at someone who was in their 20s who would speak Japanese like it was the 1920s.
Right.
Because third generation, fourth generation Japanese Americans learned their Japanese from their parents and grandparents who learned it from Japan when it was 1920s and 30s. So the new Japanese who came in the 80s are saying, oh my, this is a time warp.
Yes.
A time machine. I
Yes.
think something similar is happening around the world, wherever you have diasporic communities. And I think the Jewish experience is, of course, the most earliest one that sociologists and other people use to talk about diaspora. It's very instructive, right?
Yes.
Still, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's, you know, it's also, as you're talking, I'm thinking about on cooking shows, cooking competition shows. People are highly stressed when they're doing this. They have very few minutes to make something. And often, what will they reach to? My mother used to make this. When I would, you know, they would tell these stories and they were often reaching into their early experiences with food.
Well, you know what? Most of that, I understand, is the pressures of competition.
Of course.
Many competitors who happen to be, say, Asian American, and many of them have won so many these shows, or Filipino American these days.
Yes.
Have no training or familiarity with cooking the food of their parents. They've eaten it, but they never cooked it. However, when they look at the judges expect it, right? So in the early round, they will cook, I don't know, chicken cacciatore or something. And then the judges would say, look here, Robert Koo, why don't you make something Italian? Why not make something more close to your own tradition? And I'm thinking, I'm a freaking American, right? I grew up eating this food. I grew up eating tacos and spaghetti. I avoided Korean food growing up. So when you talk about Korean food, to me, it's my second food, actually. Second language, second food. My first food was McDonald's, right? And so, but there is an expectation that all people who are considered to be ethnic, and white people who are not supposedly, we all are, but only people of color are seen as ethnic. There's an expectation that we are perpetually foreign. And so our Americanness is somehow seen inauthentic. That's what I mean by unreliably Asian, right? So if I were on a cooking show and I made tacos, the judge might say, hey, you're Korean. Why aren't you making Korean food? Aren't you authentically Korean? And they would doubt my Americanness. How can you be American? You're an Oriental or something like that. Because Asians are perpetually seen as foreign, even if Asians have been in this country longer than many Europeans.
Right.
The Chinese immigration to America predates Italian immigration.
Absolutely.
In large numbers.
That's right.
Chop suey is more American than pizza.
Yep, that's true.
Right? Or the hot dog. But it's a persistent, this is go back to I think the white supremacy question. There are those who still resist the idea that whiteness is what they believe whiteness is the American religion. And if you're not white, then you are somehow an infidel. And it's no longer about believing Jesus or believing in God, it's about whiteness. And I think what we saw yesterday was a proof of the continual, well, it's the people carry the Confederate flag into the Capitol. People are still fighting the Civil War. And so where do then I fit in the Civil War? If you're an Asian American and there's a war between, well, black and white, where do I fit in, right? And actually Asian Americans have discussed growing up in the South during the Jim Crow era and how difficult it was to navigate the apartheid there. Do you go to the colored bathrooms if you're Asian? Do you sit at
Right.
the back of the bus? Or if you're Chinese American, where do you go? Right. So I think part of my overall intellectual project is to demystify and to demystify and mythologize the American experience, and try to uncouple it from the racialization of Black and white discourse.
That is very interesting, fascinating. My own ethnic background is that of Jews from Greece. So it's a very small community. It's not even part of the Spanish diaspora to the Sephardic group. They were there before. It's called Romaniot Jews from the time of the Romans. So I understand. It's just all quite fascinating. So.
Right, and there's always, I think, conflict that arise from this experience. The diasporic communities have so much to balance, right? I've never been to Israel. I look forward to someday doing so. But I know there's a big debate in Israel about the hummus. There's those who say the hummus is Israeli. Others who say no, it's Palestinian.
Wait till you get to the so-called Israeli salad. Just wait till you watch that movie. You're just
right.
gonna...
And the couscous, the Israeli couscous, is it North African? What is it? Right? Even in North Africa, the couscous, is it Arab or is it pre-Arab? I mean, it is because we have in so many parts of the world, geographically speaking, we have indigenous peoples mixing with settlers, mixing with immigrants,
right,
and former slaves, and they're all, I think, trying to carve out a sense of themselves upon the land and upon the citizenry, and it's such a struggle. And a lot of the struggle manifests, I think, in the foods that we consume and how we talk about foods.
Yes.
And how we tend to alienate certain kinds of food, appropriate certain foods, and so forth. So, yeah. Let's see. Susan Lagan, when I was, Susan, you still here?
I'm here.
You want to maybe ask the question in person?
I do, and I will spare you my rendition of Santoki. I spent 3 happy years.
That's a little mountain bunny. That's a kid's song. That's like, yes.
Yeah, I actually learned it at a Korean kindergarten when I was a young child, years and years ago.
You grew up in Korea?
3 years I did.
Wow.
And we had a major event in my family when we were invited to dine at the president's palace, the Blue House.
Which president was it? Do you remember?
Was it Park Chung-hee?
That was the 70s?
No. This was before then. I thought it was Park Chung-hee, but
what
again,
year?
I was 4, 5, and 6. So
you look very young. So was that the 90s then?
No. This was the 60s.
Then most likely Park Chung-hee.
Yeah. Anyhow, we went to a dinner and were served a very special delicacy when they unearthed a kimchi pot. And the kimchi had fermenting fish heads and all sorts of things, but it had been buried for 2 years. And my parents insisted that I try it to be polite, which I did. And I'm not a fan of it, but I'm curious to know if it's ever prepared that way anywhere else. I've never seen it in the US prepared with fish heads, let alone buried for 2 years.
Well, the fish heads, a lot of kimchi has seafood as a part of the ingredient, either fresh or preserved. If you saw a fish head, it might have actually been little tiny shrimp with little eyes. Was the fish head? Okay. Yeah. I've never had that type of kimchi because, like I said, there's so many varieties, and traditionally speaking, they would get these earthenware jars. They would dig a hole and they would bury it, and then they would have all these different Korean products that are fermented, such as the soy sauces and the misos and so forth. That is buried, and as they get like wine, as they get older, it's more prized. Mm-hmm. So I think the discourse around wine and cheeses overlaps the discourse around kimchi. because of its the fermented age quality and how this becomes a connoisseurship, question, right? Yeah. So interesting. You've actually met Park Chung-hee.
Did.
Yeah. So anyway, his daughter was elected president about 10 years ago. She's now in prison for
Right.
corruption.
Right?
Just on a side note, what's to me interesting is North Korea, because if you're South Korean, now it's not uncommon to see a North Korean because many of them defect. However, if you don't, most South Koreans and Koreans in America never meet a North Korean. So, but where you do get to meet North Koreans is if you travel outside of Korea. North Korea has opened up North Korean restaurants around the world, in China, in Vietnam, in Europe, wherever they would have them, in Russia. And so many South Koreans go on these tours in the groups and they visit North Korean restaurants in, say, Vietnam. And for the first time in their lives, they encounter North Koreans and North Korean food and North Korean culture, because many of the restaurants are actually, also they have shows, singing and dancing, and not like burlesque, but singing and dancing of traditional North Korean music and dance. And so many South Koreans are able to experience North Korean culture via travel. My dad was born in Northern Korea before he escaped to the South in 50s. And his favorite food is what's called naengmyeon. Naengmyeon is a buckwheat noodle like soba in cold broth. And it was originated in Northern Korea. And many of the North Koreans who came to the South during the war and escaped opened up North Korean restaurants. But eventually, South Koreans forgot that it was North Korean origin. And so yeah, you can actually go to Pyongyang, which is a capital of Korea, get Pyongyang style naengmyeon today in many places. And many South Koreans do so with a lot of nostalgia. And if you're Vietnamese, this is very similar, because the Vietnamese noodle dish called pho, not pho, but pho, P-H-O, right? Pho is also a dish of the north part of Vietnam from Hanoi. And it was brought to the South in maybe the 50s and 60s by migrants coming south to, say, Saigon. And so now in Southern Vietnam, you have Southern style pho. In America, wherever you go, wherever you have Vietnamese, you have places where they sell pho, right? But the origin of it is, of course, North. And this discourse goes back and forth. And a lot of it is nostalgia, because both Korea and Vietnam have similar experience in being part of the Cold War puppets in some sense, where our countries, the territories, was the battleground of ideologies of the superpowers, North, South, communist, not communist. And so the people were torn apart. And the scar of the division of Vietnam and of Korea is still very raw among certain older generations. And food is a site in which all of these rawness still is experienced. Also joy and comfort, because nostalgia, because Koreans in the South don't inherently hate North Koreans. And Southern Vietnamese who are now here in the United States don't inherently hate Northern Vietnamese. They may hate the political systems, but the food is something that, of course, goes way beyond political systems, right? Okay, let's see, Karen Brown. Anyone, you wanna, I don't know. Anyone else?
Hi, it's Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. I'm just sitting here with millions of questions and thought-provoking brain waves, and I wonder if you have a podcast, or if you're amazing and such a good teacher.
Oh, thank you.
And so widely, this touches so many different areas of our political systems and our family systems and our history and our hurdles today. And I often teach very young children and try to introduce them to the idea that there's a big world outside the classroom. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. That's very, very generous of you to say so. Thank you. I don't have a podcast. I think I'm too lazy to work that hard. I can barely teach. Tomorrow's my first day of class, actually. I have a class that I'm teaching about this subject I'm talking about with you today.
Really? Will it be in person or?
Talking about the changes in Korean food in the diaspora.
Wow. Big subject. In person or virtual?
Well, right now we're still only virtual, unless it's a performing arts course. If it's a theater course or a painting course, they set up, I think, socially distanced, very controlled environments where you need to go in person. But since I'm teaching and lecturing and having discussions, it's all via Zoom. I'm hoping by the, I don't know, end of the semester, we're able to meet in person. So I'll get my fingers crossed.
Well, good luck. I think you're safer that way right now. So thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Absolutely.
Okay. Pam, do you want to?
Well, thank you very much for this incredible experience. You've been so generous with your time, Robert. We just so appreciate it. I know.
It's my sincere pleasure. I'm always happy to engage this way with, like-minded people, and you all seem to have an amazing organization here. So I look forward to being part of your mail. CC was nice enough to put me in your mailing list and also for the newsletter. So I hope to maybe in the future be a viewer just like you of some of the amazing talks that you all have organized. So thank you.
Yes, I believe you will be sent our the link to our upcoming presentations every month, and hopefully we'll see you there. I mean, we just again appreciate the amount of time you've been so generous to spend with us this afternoon.
And one day, maybe post-pandemic, when it's safe to gather again, if you're all having a in-person meeting, and I'm happy to be in DC, I would love to come by and see you.
That's only because we have good restaurants, isn't it there, Robert?
DC has, oh my God, DC up Northern Virginia, where I spend a lot of time. Amazing.
I'm sure we can get a lot of our members to take you around to some of the best ones.
Okay, I look forward to it.
You've given us so many things to think